department chair, Karen Eden, is here, but she's a little under the weather today. So she invited me to introduce our speaker, who probably, for those of you who work a lot in informatics, needs no introduction. And I'm delighted that he has agreed to speak to us. Grahame Grieve, as many of you know, is the founder of the FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources Standard, which has really become the global messaging standard for health data. And he has played a significant role in it, which I will actually let him describe. One other thing unrelated to his talk that I just want to mention today is that next week our meeting is at 11 a.m. and not 11:30 today, as our usual time. And Nate Evans will be doing his PhD symposium at 11 a.m. in the Knight Cancer Institute, and you'll all get email about it. But our speaker today, and I actually want to thank our clinical informatics fellows for bringing up the idea. And while it would be fun to maybe have Grahame here in Portland, the wonders of modern technology enable him to speak with us. And he lives and works in Melbourne, Australia, where it is early Friday morning. So we're delighted he could be here. Just a few comments. He we'll hear more about his current and ongoing work with HL7 in developing the FHIR standard. He also works for a company in Australia called Health Intersections. His original education is from Auckland University in New Zealand, and but he's done many amazing things in the clinical or health informatics world. So I will turn it over to Grahame, and then our fellows, our National Library of Medicine and Clinical Informatics fellows, will also meet with him afterwards in a different WebEx room. So take it away, Grahame.
Sure, let's go. Thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And here we go. You should be seeing my screen.
We do.
Okay. All right. So where are we going and why are we going? So a little bit about me. So yes, I qualified from Auckland Uni. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the lovely introduction. I spent 6 years working in a hospital, lab medicine hospital. Then I switched to the vendor working for the hospital, did 14 years at the computing company, ended up as the CTO. And then I went contracting my own company, Health Intersections, and almost all of that time I've been FHIR community lead and product director. And FHIR is my creation. So everything is my fault, whatever it is. And I started working on FHIR, this is 12, 13 years ago now, because healthcare has broken processes. When I say that, everybody tries their very best to do their own bit of healthcare correct. There's no question about that. And generally people are very proud of that. But it's the gaps between the processes and the overall view of the processes where everybody agrees that we're broken. Other industries were being transformed, and the transformation has been considerable, and the IT enabled the process transformation. But that process wasn't happening in healthcare. And from my point of view, one of the reasons, because I was working in various projects trying to in various countries, one of the reasons is that IT standards to properly integrate business to business and consumer to business interactions did not exist. You had to use different standards. None of them were any good. And we were failing very visibly with very large amounts of money being wasted. The IT standards weren't properly implemented. That was a total, a regular feature. And so while it's true that there were standards problems, there were many other problems real problems around culture, business practice, liability and regulation. And the business part of healthcare is very sedentary. People change very, very reluctantly. Totally understandable. So from my point of view, there were lots of problems, but there's a problem I could fix due to where my experience and my access and my position. And so I decided to create FHIR. And for me, it was about taking the web and the way of working on the web and adapting it to healthcare. And so for me, FHIR is two parts. One is an open community, and the community is a real theme for me. To make it easier to exchange healthcare information, that's what we're for. We use open participation. It's just effective. We don't really know how big we are because nobody has to register or pay or whatever. Just give us the most valuable thing of all, which is time. And it's led by HL7. And then that open community meets, talks, argues, tries stuff out, and we end up producing out of our work an open standard, which describes how to exchange healthcare information. It's public domain. Another theme of what I have to do is with around openness. It's a web API and it has continuity with existing healthcare standards. We care greatly about that. And of those two, for me, the community is more important, although the focus generally is on the standard. And so when I think about FHIR, that's what we build. And I had a vision when I created FHIR. One was around open, responsive standards that were not the product of a insular process that produced standards that only suited some parts of the stakeholders. I wanted to be based on the web culture and the tech stack of the web. I wanted to integrate terminology into the picture. I'll come back to that. I wanted to build something that really scaled in terms of ability to be robust and responsive. And I wanted it to be supported by open source tooling. Come back to many of these themes. This is what I wanted. And one of the reasons using the web is very disruptive. And we were watching and have watched significant changes to business and society and culture created by the web. It's the most scalable system we've seen. It's very bad at observing boundaries. And it has destroyed some businesses and created new ones, but other companies have adapted and prospered. And I know I'd say this at this point, I'm not opposed to companies. I'm a commercial programmer. We need businesses. The focus for me is not on stopping companies from prospering. It's about how they prosper. And I don't want companies to prosper by grabbing control of a space and then leveraging that control. They have to provide services. And in some ways, the web's proven to be very unsafe. It's been very bad for some people, and some people, who cares, but other people, very unexpected side effects, and certainly change parameters around individual safety, and that's starting to really bite into society. Some of those, they're already broken, but for me, the key is to be open in your protocols, which gives people robustness and resilience. There's more to it than that, to consider security and privacy and so forth. And so I wanted to do those things in healthcare. And a huge part of that is the fact that FHIR is freely available. So we use Creative Commons public domain as the license, which is no copyright. HL7 waived any right around copyright. HL7 does protect a trademark and a logo, and we do that. It's sort of by procedure for legal reasons, but the content, if you wanted to take FHIR and wrap it up in a book and sell a book, you can do that. I mean, nobody does because we give it away, but you could. So FHIR is freely available so that there's no procedural grounds to restrict you from sharing your work, making money from the work that you do or anybody does with FHIR. We wanted to empower, and yeah, it was pretty controversial when we started, but we did that. HL7, you all know HL7, but HL7 is the big gorilla in healthcare data exchange, and in a sense, FHIR represented a powerless revolution within HL7. That was complete a few years ago. Real change to the way things happen, and it was interesting and good that it could happen within HL7, and still with continuity. So I had this idea and I published it, expecting actually to get thrown out of HL7, but no, everybody took it on. A small passionate community grew around the idea. We built a specification and tools and a web presence. Some exemplars, very early ones, went into production within a year, and are still in production. Over time, we matured, we figured out how to govern ourselves, and then we were selected by Argonaut and Apple, which I'll come back to, and more success, and it's just building on the idea. And we had a really rapid growth phase. I'm not sure the phase is over, but now it's filling out the presence that we have because we're everywhere. I've counted FHIR implementations in 100 countries now. And there's some maps of dominance in US, so we'll come back to that. Oh, didn't know we are at the point now. So here's a map that ONC published a couple of years ago of the percentage of EHRs that have certified against FHIR. And you can see that most of the country, most EHRs, if not all, have implemented FHIR. Now, we can talk, and we will talk about how much meaning that has, but you can get the point. This is actually a marker of growing success, because once you're successful, no one cares about this. You just know that you're everywhere, like version 2 is. We're getting there. And then here's a map around the world of hit counts against the test server. It's actually dropped off in US recently because who cares about the test server? Everybody knows where we are with FHIR. But you can see the spread is good. I'd like to see more spread across Africa, and it is growing. I'm so happy with that. Okay, so where are we going? For me, there was a 3-part agenda. The first thing I wanted to do was to transform healthcare IT standards. Then I wanted to transform healthcare IT, where IG comes from, healthcare IT. But my real ambition is to transform healthcare. Transforming healthcare IT standards. What are we doing here? Someone wanted to annotate, and now I can't. So let's try this. Yes, here we go. So I transformed healthcare standards. So we did rapid development with learning by implementing, with a strong community focus, integration of social media, which is the real change at the standards level. As I said, thorough integration of terminology. HL7 old specs tended to say, a code goes here, you figure it out. And yet the codes are typically the most important part of the exchange. And we changed that completely. Now, vertically integrated stack, we pay a lot of attention to terminology, and that has driven, well, I'll come back to that, and fully computable collateral. So you don't read a standard and program it, you read the standard and then integrated the content into your development process. And we did that, and with the focus on open, and really every other standard has been forced to follow our example. More open, more available, more focused on implementation collateral, more focused on being led by social media. And from my point of view, the world of healthcare standards that we have today is a far cry from where we were when I started working on FHIR. And so it's not only in FHIR that we changed. And so from my point of view, I'm happy with where we are with healthcare standards. Standards is still a difficult process because you've got to get people in the room and you've got to get people to agree. And at the end of the day, getting people to agree is still the hardest part. And we're seeing some pretty high profile cases of people not agreeing around the world right now, not in healthcare IT, but in wider politics. It remains the hard thing to do. But the way it's done, transformed. Happy with that. And interoperability is a team sport. So people contribute to drive change, which does make for some odd bedfellows, and we do not get the majority of people. We get the people who want to drive change. But what happens is companies and institutions give us their best people, and they send those to HL7, and they want to do that to create a platform for delivery of their ideas. Because as HL7 does, it actually creates ways for people to deliver things. And it turns out that people are richer and companies are richer if they can deliver their ideas on a platform people trust because it's open. If you have to buy into the platform in order to engage with the party, then they own the exchange and people are reluctant to do that. And it's a totally different value proposition than if you buy into trading with them on an open platform. So they have to deliver on their services to provide value, and you can go in elsewhere without starting from scratch. But because you have that choice, you can engage with people are much more willing to engage and much more willing to commit their own profit stake, whether it's financial or otherwise, to the platform. And so you get better profit because you didn't do everything, you didn't control everything. And so what you actually have is an open platform, which is public treasure. And that's my goal, is to make sure that as much of the platform as possible is public property and not encumbered by patents or copyright or trademarks, so that we all own it and we're all richer because we all own it. And so for me, that's, you know, one of my core goals. So how are we going with transforming healthcare IT as opposed to healthcare IT standards? The key goal is to reduce the cost of interoperability. So let's do a case study. In 2010 was the year of personal health records at HIMSS. And here we are, not at HIMSS. I've been to HIMSS so many years, other than COVID, but I'm sitting it out this year. And everybody was trying to sell personal health records to institutions, and they were competing with each other. And I went around and did talking to some people in the business of doing personal health record systems. The total cost of ownership for connecting to a personal health care record, when talking to marketing and sales and contract negotiations and development and maintenance, the total cost to an institution was in the region of 150,000 US. And what happened was the government created a project involving EHR vendors with a goal that they were told to define a public API for patients to get their own data. And they could use it for other purposes, and we'll come back to that other purpose. The outcome was an industry spec for letting patients get their healthcare data summary, those things. And it's gradually growing. It's happened. And they used FHIR. They chose to use FHIR, and we worked with them to figure out what that API looks like and how to make it secure. And they committed, substantial development to that. And then Apple came along and used it in healthcare. And very unusual for Apple to use a public spec that they don't own, because they do like to own the platform. But this is healthcare; they're not the big kahuna. So now the way it works, hospitals can register with Apple for free. They get the software with the capability for free. Okay, so it's built into the framework. It's not free, but they register with Apple for free. They pass the Apple testing process, but that typically isn't that much work. And they have to maintain patient portal accounts, so they have to do that anyway. So the reduction in cost is in the region of 90%, the TCO for that. And it's a region of 90%. This is 90% is pretty substantial, and that's what comes from commoditization. And so you can reduce the cost of interoperability by an order of magnitude. which is good for everybody. And when I first started pushing this idea that we could reduce the cost of interoperability by 90%, my co-peers at HL7 were freaked because that'll reduce the investment, but actually increases the investment because you get transformation and outcomes for less money, and so you spend more money to get more outcomes because you believe in those outcomes instead of finding them frustratingly expensive and over the horizon. Now, as I said before, and I didn't really say it before, IT itself doesn't drive change. It blocks change because it's too hard, but it doesn't actually solve any question. What we really need to do is drive change in healthcare. So clinical champions to drive actual changes. That's the hard part. I have no doubt about that. We're doing the easy bit. It's great for me. But we intend to be disruptive. Not in terms of which companies do it. I don't care about who succeeds, but I want to drive companies to succeed by providing better services. So a very quick detour across a bunch of slides, but one problem that was clear from the very beginning for me when I first started working in a hospital is clinical record systems have massive amounts of data, but it's really hard to do anything with it. And it's really hard, particularly, to do anything in real time. And vendors just can't do everything. And then when I ended up running a vendor and deciding where we would make our business decisions, the one thing that becomes really clear is it sounds like it should be easy, but man, it's really hard and nobody is going to be happy. You just can't do everything. It's not economically feasible. So if you have an open API that lets you access data and services and the user interface that's integrated into a security and process wise into the app, then people can extend your app without you having to do the work. And so here's an example from Allscripts which is because I grabbed the screenshot, and you can actually make your own application down in the bottom corner that's integrated into the context and the content, but does what you want in organizational policy. And yes, you can have limitlessly extensible and configurable, programmable EHRs, and EHRs are really platforms for EHRs, but you can't scale that because it's specific to each EHR. Whereas if you have a common platform, you get the platform benefits. I talked about that. And so for me, part of this is moving from what I call shallow to deep interoperability. On the left, shallow, a typical system of what I used to get, what we bought, what we had in the 1990s and early 2000s, where you've got a bunch of components, and when people ask you to do integration, you do a specific piece of code that sits on the perimeter of the system and handles the integration, function by function. And the integration points are paid for individually. And that sounds like a really good model to a vendor. And I hear constantly from consumers of EHRs and enterprise information systems generally that that's a profitable business for the vendor. I assure you it's not. It's a bad business to be in. It's really hard to find programmers who want to do that. It's really hard to maintain those things. You charge apparently lots of money, but then you bleed later on them. And it's no good for the customers either. It's a bad model. It's a much better model to move to where you create the integration points as part of your own system on the right. And you document them and you make them available to all consumers, and then you provide point consumers. And so you have a platform system rather than a closed walled garden. And part of what I've done with FHIR is to tilt the playing field, to start pushing everybody to the right model, to the model on the right, which is also the right model. It takes time, decades, for existing systems to move, and they won't do that until they're under real pressure. We'll come back to that. But for me, that is a big transformation that's happened outside health and is happening in healthcare. So empower application stuff for more functionality, less cost, towards being interoperable at the core, to best of breed, and to open source driving change in market. I'll comment on this at this point. Open source is the worst thing that you can get in any particular market. When I first heard that, I'm like, there's no way. Open source is a much better model. But actually, if you are selling something and it's not as good as the free open source alternative, what happens? You cease to exist or you get better. And so open source is actually the floor of the market, forcing everybody up. And we're in that business of forcing everybody up. Yeah, and so the standards had the potential to erode the significant barriers to entry put around their proprietary walled gardens, which is what I was just talking about. And yes, that was a problem in how people look at standards. And there were people who didn't like it, and there were people still worried about replacing the existing EHRs with just commodity clinical record as a service in the cloud, where you pay per patient record or transaction or whatever and mix things possible. We're getting to the point where if you mix FHIR with a bunch of other generic APIs out of the cloud, you can get to clinical record as a service. And there are such systems available today. They are doing what software as a service does and starting at the very bottom of the market for complexity and working upwards over time. And so we don't know how long that will take, but I predict that in 30 years' time, that's all there will be, is clinical record as a service in the cloud. Now, how quickly that happens, we'll get back to that. Now, one thing about this that it drives questions to everybody is, to what degree should you use standards? And the one thing that is really clear to me from where I am is standards increase the initial cost of development. They totally cost you more money up front. And this is counter to what people say. Use standards to save money. But and I'm sure many of you have experienced this and are well aware of this, but lots of people are not. That you actually encounter all the requirements before you have maturity. Standards are always messy, and you have to build the knowledge of the standards. And so it costs you more money up front. The real savings are long term. You're much more likely to run into unexpected requirements that force you to change. Very expensive business. So less mistakes. So for me, that's the single biggest economic advantage of using standards, is you are much less likely to make mistakes. But you get more reuse of existing code. It's more stable. It's more maintainable. It's easier to incorporate experienced people into the team, and maintaining the team, single hardest thing. You get better quality. And so long term, your cost goes down, but of course you don't feel, it's really hard to measure. And it's actually very little economic work around measuring the cost. It's kind of like the reverse of an opportunity cost. It's a non-opportunity non-cost, and it's very hard to grapple with that economically. I wish there was more work around that. And I'll skip that slide. So FHIR led to easier and faster integration, which is why all the excitement Bill referred to. We reuse as much as we can, although we tend, actually, we're kind of out in the lead now, but we have a really active and open community, and those factors will drive down the cost of integration and interoperability. So and where are we? That is happening. It has not finished happening. It is not banked, but it is happening, and it is unstoppable. So I'm happy with that. So FHIR is not a silver bullet, though. It is a nice technology and yes, it's a nice technology, but it only captures what everybody can agree to. And so that's a platform that we can build further agreements on, but we have to, because we can't get everybody to agree about everything. We get more agreements when we get smaller groups. The smaller the group, the more it can agree to, because the more it has in common around it. And so countries, domains, technologies, business agreements, frameworks, the more we already agree about other things, the more we can agree in the face of FHIR. And so it would be really nice if we could produce a single spec that just standardized healthcare. It would be very large, but everybody would agree to it. But that's not the world that I live in. I can't get people to agree to everything because they disagree about everything outside FHIR. So our ability to do that is limited, and people need to build their own further agreements. And so that's totally a problem. Some of you will have played Jackbox. My daughters love Jackbox, and we were playing it last night. And they got those ones where they show these insane, incoherent motivational posters. And I saw this one last night, went by in the game, and I loved it. Consistency. We're all in students together. Jackbox. Totally recommend it. But consistency, we are students in this together. So yes, you need to publish implementation guides. There's a whole business now for publishing implementation guides. But fundamentally, international standards create platforms that then you make further agreements on. There is no way around that model. And for me, it's like a slinky dog. There's this, the two ends can go in different directions of standards and innovation. Standards are really interesting because you make rules about what you can't do in order to create innovation. But you create innovation at a different level if you get it right. But standards are like startups, very prone to failing. So as the sort of product lead, community lead, this is what I think a lot about is at what level are we taking people's options away? And at what level are we creating people's options in order to empower healthcare IT to solve healthcare's problems? And the front and the back of the dog go in different directions for a little while, but the further they go in different directions, the more likely there is to be some kind of painful snapback. So that's kind of the way that I think about standards and innovation. So yes, no, I want to talk about this. All right, so disrupting healthcare IT is a work in progress. Now let's talk about disrupting healthcare, because for me, that's the ultimate goal. Now, I want to empower patients. This is an agenda shared with lots of people, not just me, but yes, I'm part of that. I want to empower patients. Make data accessible to patients. Make data from patients accessible to the system. Allow patients to control the data sharing between the parties so that they're more likely to share the actual data of importance, and creating a common patient record. So my rule on that is institutions keep patient records for institutional purposes. It is not for the benefit of the people who create the records, nor for the benefit of the people who the records are about. And so that drives the way in which they create and store the records, and it doesn't serve the people in the system. And I want to unbundle storing records from institutions to empower both the providers and the receivers of healthcare. But the thing is, data is, who cares? So you give me all the data about me and I go, yeah, I knew I'm not very healthy, whatever. Services are empowering. And for me, it's always been about providing services to the patient and allowing the patient to control and pivot the services from their palm rather than being the victim of the system that they can't control. So we have a focus at the moment on giving patients access to their own data, but it's a very small percentage of patients' lives change because they have the data. There are some totally transform their lives, and that's good. But distributed healthcare services are the future. Now, from an institutional point of view, you actually spend a huge amount of an institution's attention on creating the rules and keeping records. And then you have to share those records, and it's very difficult to share them and keep faith with a social contract. And there's a huge amount of technical debt in most institutions where their sharing policies are super complicated and super out of control, and who knows when it's going to blow up. And it's actually a huge cost burden relief just to shove the data on the patient and let the patient manage the social contract around sharing the data, rather than you sharing it behind their back. That will become a growing issue in healthcare as people realize what's happened to their very private data. A huge private cultural leap to leap from sharing it as an institution to sharing it via the patient. But that will happen. But to go back to my original point, we measure clinical systems and their outcomes and their safety compartmentally, whereas we think about the behavior of the system, not the outcomes for the patient. And patient outcomes are really hard to measure, hard to improve, and patients have astonishing little influence over the process. And really, for me, I want to see patient outcomes improve. When I talk to my family about why I'm choosing to do this rather than make more money as a consultant, which I totally could, we choose to do this because we want to improve patient outcomes, including for our own family and also for everybody. And for me, the focus of that is going to be on coordinated care. It's a common frustration of patients. You're scheduling communication problems across the system, conflicting care plans. And my mother-in-law went to a GP. He referred her to a specialist. The specialist put her on a treatment plan and medication. She went back to the GP, and the GP said, "Don't do that. That's a terrible choice for your medication." And then she went back to the specialist, and the specialist said, "If you're not going to do what I said, why do you come to me?" She can't resolve that conflict. It's still, I was visited her this week. She's getting pretty old, but it's still an acute confusion and concern, like acutely bothering her, that her GP and a specialist don't agree. How is she supposed to resolve that? Sometimes they don't even agree about what success is, and the patient is left trying to resolve this. This is insane, and we can do better. FHIR enables services for distributed care plan management, for virtual clinical review. You don't need to have institutional walls. You don't need bricks to make this happen anymore. We can have virtual institutions meshing with each other across institutions. Government at the moment, the healthcare system does governance by brick wall almost exclusively. It is changing, but very slowly. And so this for me is where I want to see us go. But we are only going there a little bit and very slowly. And that is where we are. So standards are still very hard to land. Sorry, I'll finish up on this idea. So we are going there very slowly, too slowly for me. We're all getting older. We're all about to run into this as we, sooner or later, we're going to run into this problem as patients. But the change that I want to see here, where I'll tell you one more story. A friend of mine, she found a lump in her breast. She went to the GP. The GP referred her to a specialist. The specialist sent us off for imaging. She went and got the imaging. She went back to the specialist. He sent her off for some more imaging. She went and got the more imaging. She went back to the specialist. He made an appointment in the hospital. The hospital mucked her around. And so chemo started 9 months to the day after she found the lump. There's odd things about her case, but 9 months? That could have all happened in a day. Would have been better for her. Why is that? And it's a lot to do with institutional boundaries and scheduling boundaries and so forth. Now, we can cut that time down, maybe not to a day, which would be physically possible, but organizationally insanely difficult. But we can cut it down from 9 months. My dad had a similar experience with his prostate cancer. It's not so bad in some countries and others. There's always reasons, but we can do better, and we should do better. But we are only starting this really slowly. Okay. The standard is still very hard to land. Everybody knows that. And there's this kind of rumor or reputation of FHIR that it makes it all easy. No, it's not easy. It's never going to be easy. It's easier. Easier is what I wanted. But the option of FHIR is still not mission critical. And for all the progress that we can talk about and the numbers we can throw around, the reality is that we still live in a very divided ecosystem, very fractured ecosystem. So let's do a review of systems. How are we going with FHIR and where are we going? It's all about the people. It's always all about the people. The people you have, the people you can collect, your culture, though that is, in the end, the only thing that matters. People are our biggest deficiency. We need more of everything. I have built a enthusiastic, passionate, engaged community. That's the thing I'm most proud of. But we just need more. Everywhere I go, we just need more. And in some ways, it's totally insane. Healthcare IT pays well, is an interesting problem, maxes on social justice, you're never going to be out of work. Like, Why isn't everybody doing it? It's insane that people are our biggest deficiency. But it is what it is, and we have to work with that. But I'm pretty happy with where our community is. We just need more. Right, with standards, the standards of paper trail of our arguments. Oh, this slide's old. Release 5 is published, but the cadence of release is slowing down as we follow the inevitable social rules around forming, storming, norming, conforming. We're getting a lot further into that. We did a major lift on the terminology ecosystem, and for me, that's one of the more significant things we achieved around the world, not so much in the States, because there isn't ecosystem leadership on this, and I'm trying to change that. We're now seeing wide deployment of really good terminology services integrated very well into EHRs and other clinical systems, and really starting to get some benefit from that. We have hundreds of implementation guides, the infrastructure for catalyzing and supporting communities to come to agreement and share those agreements is holding up. I'm pretty happy with where the standard is. It's not perfect, never perfect, and we continue to stress about that. But for me, it's no longer where the focus should be. We should be moving on. HL7, in terms of where it is, HL7 adapted to change well. It was pay to use, and now pay HL7 to use the standards. Now people pay to influence how HL7 changes. Don't worry about the internal bits of this. It's been economically challenging for HL7 to actually completely change the way that it's paid and the reason that it's paid. And now we have an implementation arm, and HL7 is still going through substantial change. But we live in a post-social media world, which, I mean, it's going to start biting other clinical standardization communities. That's going to be really interesting to watch. So in the implementation space, as I talked about, Rival Plan is playing out. The breadth and depth of adoption is more than we expected, and particularly this caught me by surprise, the political ramifications. I've visited the White House, I've been to Brussels. I was supposed to go to Beijing to meet with politicians in Beijing. That didn't happen because COVID, and then China had a big biffo with Australia, so I wasn't welcome. But still, the idea that it was political really caught me by surprise. We're just doing, in really point focus on standards. It's still harder to get people to agree. And there's some things that we need that still are working. But one thing I'm really happy about is the growth of open source implementations is forcing everybody to work on their systems really hard. So I'm happy about that. So where are we from my point of view? Why did I do this? Because I had to try. I had to believe that we could be in a better place than we were, and I had to commit to doing it. I considered walking away from healthcare IT as a disaster of awesome proportions, and I know people who have, and they've walked. I know nurses who've walked away from doing nursing because it was, and doctors too, because the system was too chaotic, and they felt that they were accountable for doing something that they couldn't do. And all of us have had that feeling and experience in healthcare, I'm sure. And I really came to a crossroads and said, I really need to commit to doing this, and I can, so I will. So how did that go? For me, it was much more demanding, and it's been much more personal than I expected. It's turned into something more than a job. It's a mission. But when I look across what we've done, we've got enough projects around the world that I can look at the projects and say, they've made a real difference to people's lives. They've made people's lives longer, happier, healthier. And so it's incredibly rewarding to know that we have made a real difference. Are we done? No, we're not done yet. Are we ever going to be happy? No, we're never going to be happy. And you know, in 20 years' time, if I'm still around and working, probably will be, probably, so much for retiring. In 20 years' time, if I'm still working, will I hear the same noise about interoperability and how hard it is? Totally, totally. I'll hear the same noise, and people will be like, "Fire, it's just holding us back. It's terrible." Because that's actually about how people feel and about how people interact, and people aren't going to change fundamentally. But we'll be arguing about and being frustrated about something that we don't even think about today. 20 years ago, we were like, ADT is a problem. It's so hard. And now we just expect it to work, and we're kind of surprised when it doesn't. As ADT, HL7v2 ADT feeds. It will be the same. The things that we're doing in 20 years' time will be focusing the same amount of angst about, but the stuff we're trying to do today, that'll just work. And it helps to separate out the people problems from the tech problems. In the end, this is about people and getting people to agree and to focus. So it's incredibly rewarding for me that we've made a difference. I'm going to finish up and talk a little bit about governance and then have some questions. And then, as Bill said, we'll switch. So for me, it's critical that we have good governance. I talked before about building a platform. You can't build a platform unless you have governance over the platform that people agree in. So the fundamental thing that we're involved in with FHIR is governance. I think of FHIR as a $1 trillion ecosystem. $1 trillion. And I get to that number by summing up all of the money that people will spend on systems and healthcare that they would have to re-spend if they changed from using FHIR. So they're using FHIR to do things, and the things, they will spend $1 trillion on those things across the world over a decade. It sounds like a huge amount of money, but $1,000 billion projects, everywhere. And people do, so maybe it won't be $1 trillion, but it's that kind of ballpark figure, $1 trillion. And so we have to do governance, good enough for that. Stable governance, review over, so HL7 gets looked over a shoulder by ANSI. We have to say what we do what we say, keep good records about the fact that we did what we said we would do, and keep our faith with the social contract, with the public, with the FHIR community, with the HL7 members, and most of all with the HL7 insiders who are there for that governance. And if we do that correct, if we govern ourselves, then we can build a platform that people trust. And we need to demonstrate every day that we are worth that trust, and that we build that, and that if you commit to us, you commit your treasure with us, we will look after that on behalf of everybody. And so a lot of what I think about is how to do that and how to deliver on that. I think you can all see, if you look around the world, that good governance is hard. It's hard to build, it's hard to keep, it's hard to deliver on, because it competes with other impulses that humans have and share too easily. And so in the end, for me, FHIR is a personal statement about civil society. So we set out to disrupt healthcare by significantly reducing the cost, making it easy to use the web and creative and community, and that worked. But we did that fundamentally by building public treasure through open community. And for me, that's the essence of civil society. That's what built the society that we have. People use the word democracy, but what I think they really mean is a civil society where good governance rewards participation in civil development. And I feel really fragile about that in the big picture right now. There's lots of assaults on civil society, and they're both natural and organized, and they are really costing us now. And so I encourage all of you, And I'm preaching to the converted, given this audience, but I always encourage everybody to contribute to civil society by contributing to public treasure. Now, you can do it with the FHIR community, but we're pretty big and busy. There's all these allied communities around clinical knowledge, clinical development, domain development of content and rules for exchange, or just education. But I always encourage everybody, spend a few hours every week contributing to the infrastructure that supports civil society. So join us, not necessarily in the FHIR community, but in building something bigger and better. So thank you. I'll stop at that point. Thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting. Happy to take questions and comments. And I'll stop sharing. And back to you, Bill.
Great. Thanks, Graham. It's great to hear a kind of personal story of what motivated you. It adds a lot of perspective to the technical side of things. So to the audience, you're welcome to ask questions. You can either unmute yourself and speak up on the screen, or you can type into the chat. And if there's things in the chat, I will read them. Does anyone have any questions for Graham? Well,
Hey there, Bill. Hey, Graham.
okay.
Hello.
Hey, thank you so much for coming out to meet with us. I've been such a fan of FHIR, and I look forward to how it changes the way we implement digital health. Well, one question I had, and I think this is a question you probably had before because everyone is bound to ask it, is and the quick version of the question is how is new AI related technology, particularly the natural language power of LLMs, going to affect or change the way we do interoperability? And in particular, the longer version of that is, so I see interoperability as fundamentally a problem of trying to impose human semantics on a world that is fundamentally not structured. And there's always going to be differences in the way we internally represent things semantically, and also these internal representations will change over time. Do technologies like LLMs and future AI technologies maybe help to bridge that gap in changes so that FHIR maintains a evolving standard or something else in some other form?
So there's some pretty interesting aspects to that question. Thank you. First of all, directly, we saw AI coming 10 years ago. So we're designing from start for AI. And the only thing that surprised me about how that's playing out is the speed that it's played out at the last 12, 18 months. Other than that, it's pretty predictable. We have an open debate within the FHIR community as to whether LLMs in particular will reduce the focus on structured data and back towards narrative. And there's certainly evidence that narrative is more reliable because people are usually on the hook for it in a legal sense, and it's as easy to process as structured data. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that the subtleties of narrative are often lost, and LLMs don't really understand what's going on, and so can easily go off in the wrong direction. And that if you want to deal with the long tail of fantasy that comes out of LLM, you will need structured data. And so that will, as you try and land that stuff, you will be pushed back to the structured data. And so we have an open debate in the FHIR community as to how that's going to play out and whether LLMs will ever be able to bridge the gap with a real world ontology. And one of the things I've been trying to build and struggling with from the very beginning of FHIR is to make sure it's firmly mapped to ontologies to support that kind of reasoning. But the trouble is the world that ontologies live in is so radically different from the world that operational healthcare systems live in that I struggle to find support for really simple operational healthcare concepts in ontologies. And for me, that's actually a bigger picture question. A lot of my work, you know, I did a PhD in epidemiology and data analysis in diabetes and heart disease. And a lot of what we did was extract out simplified views of the world from the complex operational healthcare data. And that's what we did our actual analysis on. So our actual published papers are published in a fantasy world. All science research is based on a fantasy world, which is simplified from reality. And I had a physics professor who started every like physics example he started with. Imagine a brown cow, spherical brown cow of uniform density, just to remind everybody every time that research and academic is based on a simplified view of the real world. So I think there's a lot of water to go under the bridge in that space yet, in terms of understanding how that plays out. And one thing that's really happened in the last 18 months, a bit of a surprise, is just how much VC money and has gone to AI. I mean, if you're not AI, you can't make money right now. You can't raise money. And all of the AI projects are like, the better your AI, the more likely you are to make money. And I'm like, simply doesn't matter how good your AI is. It's always the last mile, the integration, the delivery, the hard, yucky work of working with people that is going to control your money. And almost all of the AI companies have burned their money on buying data and training the AI. And they don't have, most of them don't have a plan for actually when the money starts being spent, which is that last yucky mile. And so there's going to be a lot of burnt people from the VC level out of AI and healthcare, and we'll be living with a wreckage in 10 years time and maybe 5 years time. So one of my priorities is to make sure that people don't turn around and blame the data layer, FHIR, right? So that I am thinking about that in terms of AI. I mean, you can do it right. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying that most AI companies are not doing it right. No doubt there are some that are. And in the big picture, I think that AI will increase the appetite for data and data access, and for integration of AI done well. You need to take AI, keep training it, keep learning, and keep feeding the input of that into the real live process. And so that will increase the appetite for interoperability in the medium term. Long term, I don't want to make any more predictions than I have.
Great. Ben Orwell has his hand up, so I'll let Ben go, and then I see there's a question in the chat. That'll probably be the hour, but go ahead, Ben.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm sorry for the background noise. Graham, thank you so much for coming and visiting and talking with us. I wonder what your perspective is now after it's been a few years, but it seems like at least in the U.S., you know, there's been a lot of support from the government in terms of putting FHIR front and center in various regulatory type of certifications and laws related to information blocking and things like that. And I wonder if you can give a little bit of perspective just on your thoughts on, like, how much does it help, or how much is it necessary that, like, governments put in requirements for things like standards, versus is it more actually the other direction, that governments choose the standards for their requirements based on how good and popular the standards actually are?
Well, it's totally a feedback process, circular feedback process, where governments and regulation authorities choose what they're told to choose by the market. And I've certainly drawn into arguments all over the world where they're on the course that they are on, and the market's going, this is stupid. You want what you want, when what we want is to change. On the other hand, the market will not get there on its own. We're all in a broken market where our incentives to change are not enough to make the change happen without a substantial push from the market controller. So I have never seen a really significant shift without the government driving that. And the government can totally, and there are still countries in the world where the government's like, oh, we chose our path before FHIR came along, oh, we're not changing, and we're just going to keep doing it, and it just causes acute confusion, and chaos. So there are still a few countries in that they will eventually change. It's inevitable, right? Because FHIR offers better outcomes for the same amount of money, and in the end, they always care about that. So they will get there, but it's about very few people, and so it's unpredictable, and so that's a problem with government. And there are totally ways in which the government can totally screw it up by micromanaging the process or whatever. But it won't happen without that push from above, from the ultimate payer in the end. As an agent of society to tell the market, you need to change. And so that's totally a dangerous process, but it's also a necessary process. And we just have to suck it up and figure out how to get that right.
Great. So I assume you can see the chat. There's a couple questions there. Maybe I'll let you kind of pick what you want to say, and then we'll wrap things up from there.
Do I feel a proliferation of standards might result in risks? Totally, of course. But of course, everything that you do that is beneficial also involves risks. And I had a whole bunch of slides I took about it, managing safety and risk. Yes, there are risks, but you can get this right. If we care and if we implement and if we keep it and we have the right culture, it can be sorted. And actually, FHIR is a much better way of exchanging data in terms of security and privacy because it's not based on old tech. And so we reuse everybody else's tech on that. That's all I'll say for that now.
There's one other question below it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
What is the impact of the trends I discussed on patient-centric records and interoperability? I think that we're going through a phase where people, the government and clinical societies are using regulation to drive changes, micromanage changes in clinical practice. And that's causing acute confusion because they shouldn't be doing that. But they should be driving change at the macro level, the micro level. And I expect that process will work itself out over another decade. It's about a decade, as people might experience, whether people think it's not a tech problem, it's a people problem. But if we get over that and get to a world which Karen Alliance is working on, where you have patient-centric records rather than institutional-centric records, then I think people will step back and say, those ways of driving change through institutional incentives and through ham-fisted requirements for documentation that's often not relevant, leading to long documentation and then people gaming the system, that's not the answer. The answer is outcome-based assessments. We can't do that. So we focus on, it's like the military focusing on body counts rather than actual outcomes, which is still totally a thing today. No, you need to focus on outcomes. But if we could get to a full patient record, we can actually think about outcomes at a holistic level rather than outcomes at a process level. What I'll say about that.
Good. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your story and everything you've accomplished. So we'll convene this session, and then there's another link that you have, Graham, and that our fellows have, and we'll reconvene there in about 10 minutes. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Bye.